A black couple boards their long-awaited vacation flight, excited for the trip they saved for months to take. But just minutes after takeoff, everything shifts. A flight attendant's subtle prejudice turns into something more sinister. A single cold remark spirals into public humiliation, igniting a confrontation that leaves the entire cabin watching. What happens next shocks everyone, unraveling hidden biases at 30,000 feet and forcing the airline to make decisions that ripple far beyond the flight. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that need to be told. The air in the cabin was still, the kind of stillness that hummed beneath the sound of distant voices and the gentle whir of engines. Sam leaned back into his seat, his gaze resting lazily on the stretch of clouds outside the window. The sun spilled over the horizon, painting the sky in pale golds and quiet blues. It was peaceful almost. Grace sat beside him, thumbing through a magazine she wasn't really reading. Her body was there, but her mind was elsewhere, caught somewhere between excitement for the vacation they had planned and the familiar twinge that always sat with her in spaces like this. Airports, hotels, restaurants, they all carried the same undercurrent, the same subtle weight that followed her and Sam like an unwanted shadow. She had told herself not to think about it. Not today. This was their time, the trip they had saved for, talked about, built up in their minds for months. She wanted to let that excitement wash over her. But there was always something. A glance that lingered too long. A smile that felt a little too stiff. The small ways the world reminded them this space wasn't built for you. Sam caught her glance and gave her hand a squeeze, grounding her back in the moment. He smiled, and for a moment, she let herself believe that maybe this flight would be different. The flight attendant, a woman with neat blonde hair pinned into a bun, appeared at the front of the cabin. She moved down the aisle with the mechanical ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her name tag read Karen. "Anything I can get you?" Karen asked, her voice high and practiced. Grace looked up and smiled politely. "No, thank you." Karen nodded, but her eyes lingered just a little longer than they should have. It wasn't much, barely a second. But Grace felt it, a flicker of something behind that smile. Something she had seen before. It was subtle, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But Grace was always paying attention. The feeling didn't settle. As Karen continued down the aisle, Sam leaned over. "You okay?" Grace hesitated. "Yeah, I'm fine." But the hum in her chest told her otherwise. The plane ascended smoothly, the clouds slipping beneath them like distant waves. For a time, there was nothing but quiet, the rhythmic sounds of people flipping through books. Dozing off, chatting softly, Sam settled into his seat, letting his head fall back against the cushion. Grace returned to her magazine. But she wasn't reading, she was waiting. It wasn't long before Karen passed by again. This time, Grace felt the shift before she heard it. Sam had adjusted in his seat, reaching for the button to recline just slightly. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice sharper now. "You need to sit back properly." Sam's brows knit together as he straightened. You need to stay seated correctly," Karen repeated, cutting him off. Grace glanced at Sam. He hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't even halfway reclined, just shifting in his space. But there was no room for explanation. Karen's eyes were already moving past them, as if his presence itself was an irritation, something to be corrected and dismissed. Grace felt the heat rising, low but steady. She wanted to say something, but the words stuck. She knew the rules. Speak up too quickly, and you're the one causing the scene. Let it go, and you swallow another piece of yourself. Sam exhaled quietly, shaking his head, but he said nothing. They let it pass, but the weight didn't leave. When Karen returned, it wasn't to ask if they needed water or snacks. It was with something else in her eyes, something brittle. "You people never seem to follow the rules. Do you?" she said, just loud enough that the couple seated across the aisle turned their heads. Grace's breath hitched. The words hung there, thick and sharp. She heard them echo in the space between her ribs, pressing down on the soft parts of her. Sam sat up straighter, his jaw tight, his knuckles pale against the armrest. There it was. The stillness Grace had felt at the beginning was gone, shattered in 3 seconds by 6 words that carried the weight of something far older than the flight they were on. It was no longer about a seat. It never had been. The air changed. Electric now. Buzzing with the things that were left unsaid. Grace felt the stares pressing in the ones that watched but said nothing. The ones that glanced away too quickly. This wasn't the first time she'd been here. But every time it happened, it felt fresh, raw, as if she had walked into the fire without realizing it. The plane moved forward through the sky. But inside, they were stuck, trapped between anger and restraint. Between what they wanted to say and what they couldn't afford to. Sam shifted in his seat, leaning closer to Grace. His voice was low, tight. I should say something. Grace looked at him, her eyes soft but steady. Not yet, she whispered. Not yet. But in her heart, she knew. It was coming. The plane seemed quieter now. Though the engines hummed on just the same. There was a peculiar stillness in the cabin. The kind that slips in unnoticed, wrapping itself around you like a second skin. Sam shifted in his seat. His body angled just slightly toward Grace, as if leaning into her presence would soften the weight that had settled between them. He wasn't angry yet, not fully, not the way Grace was. She could feel it rising. That slow burn she knew too well. The one that crept up the back of her neck and curled itself around her shoulders. She had lived with this feeling for years, had grown accustomed to it the way you grow used to the ache in an old injury. You carry it because you must. Because setting it down means letting yourself believe it isn't there. And it is always there. Karen's words still hung in the air like smoke. You people. The phrase itself wasn't new. Grace had heard it in grocery stores and restaurants. In the clipped voices of coworkers who thought they were being discreet. It wasn't the words alone that stung, but the ease with which they had been spoken, the casual confidence that told her this wasn't the first time. Nor would it be the last. Sam exhaled slowly through his nose. His gaze fixed on the headrest in front of him. He was still trying to let it pass. She could tell. His hands, though, betrayed him, fingers tapping out a restless rhythm against his knee. His knuckles tightening just slightly with every passing second. She's watching, Grace whispered, without turning her head. Sam's hand stilled. Karen was making her way back up the aisle, her eyes flicking across the rows like someone checking for a loose thread. Grace saw it for what it was. This wasn't about regulations, or safety, or some misplaced sense of authority. This was something older, something less spoken but more dangerous. It was about control. Sam's voice was soft, but there was an edge beneath it. I wasn't even doing anything. Grace nodded. I know. She had thought perhaps foolishly that things would be different now. They were older. They dressed well. They carried themselves with the quiet dignity that years of being watched had taught them. But none of it mattered. Not here. The sky outside stretched endless and blue. But inside the cabin, the space seemed smaller somehow. Karen stopped at their row again, leaning in just slightly as if she were about to deliver some private piece of information meant only for them. Is there something I can help you with? She asked. But there was no warmth in the question. Grace smiled tightly. A practiced thing, thin at the edges. No, thank you. We're fine. Karen lingered. Her eyes, sharp and appraising, flickered between the two of them. Grace could see her calculating, measuring the weight of the response she might receive if she pushed further. It was an old game. One Grace had played more times than she cared to admit. Finally, Karen straightened, smoothing down the front of her uniform. Let me know if you need anything. Grace held her breath until Karen disappeared toward the front of the cabin. Sam shifted beside her. His voice was low, but tight enough that Grace felt the tension coil in her stomach. I don't like the way she's looking at us. Grace's eyes stayed forward. She's waiting for us to react. That's what this is. Sam's laugh was short and humorless. I know, but knowing didn't make it easier. The plane dipped slightly as the captain adjusted their course. A seatbelt sign flickered overhead, and a soft voice filtered through the speakers, reminding passengers to remain seated. Grace glanced sideways at Sam. His jaw was set now, his hand resting stiffly on the armrest. He wasn't looking out the window anymore. His attention was fixed, sharp and unmoving, on the aisle. She's coming back, he said quietly. Grace didn't have to look to know he was right. Karen's footsteps were unhurried, but deliberate. This time, she didn't stop beside them. She leaned slightly toward an older white man sitting across the aisle. Her voice lowered just enough that Grace had to strain to hear. They've been moving around a lot, Karen said, loud enough for Grace to catch the words but quiet enough to pretend she hadn't meant for them to. The man nodded. his gaze shifting briefly toward Sam and Grace before settling back on the book in his lap. Grace's fingers curled tightly in her lap. The insult wasn't just the words themselves, it was how easily they had slipped into the air. How quickly they found a willing ear. Sam turned to Grace, his voice tight. "I don't care if she's waiting for a reaction. I'm not letting this go." Grace looked at him for a long moment, weighing the options, the risks. She saw the tension in his eyes, the silent plea for her to understand that he couldn't sit quietly this time. She nodded. "Okay," she said, softly but firmly. It was Sam who called Julia over. The younger flight attendant appeared moments later, her eyes flicking toward Karen, who stood a few rows away. "I need to speak with someone in charge," Sam said, his voice calm but unyielding. Julia hesitated. Grace could see the conflict in her face, the nervous glance she cast toward Karen before responding. "Of course," Julia said. "I'll get the supervisor." As Julia disappeared toward the back of the plane, Grace felt Karen's eyes on them again. This time, she didn't look away. The hum of the plane seemed louder now, pressing against Grace's ears as she waited. There was no turning back from this, not for Sam, not for her. Karen had drawn the line, and Grace had no intention of stepping quietly over it. Julia returned with Mark, the supervisor, trailing just behind her. His expression was unreadable, but Grace had seen that face before, the calm, practiced neutrality of a man trying to assess the damage before he knew the full story. Mark crouched slightly to meet Sam's eye level, his voice low but businesslike. "I understand there's been an issue?" Sam's jaw twitched as he nodded. "Your flight attendant Karen, she's been watching us, bothering us, and now she's making comments to other passengers. It's not the first time she's come by." Grace watched the way Mark's face shifted almost imperceptibly. There was a flicker of recognition, a flash of something in his eyes that told her he understood exactly what Sam meant but wasn't sure how much he wanted to acknowledge. "I see," Mark said, straightening slightly. His gaze drifted just for a moment toward Karen, who stood a few rows down the aisle pretending not to listen. Grace leaned forward, her voice soft but edged with steel. "I need you to understand something. We didn't ask for this. We've been sitting quietly. She came to us." Mark nodded slowly, but his eyes were distant. "I'll handle it," he said. "I'm sure there's been some miscommunication." Grace felt something tighten in her chest. Miscommunication. It was always that word. A soft, easy bridge between intention and consequence. Between the insult and the apology that rarely followed. Sam's voice cut through the space between them. "No, don't explain this away. She singled us out." Mark hesitated. His eyes narrowed slightly. His shoulders stiffened. Grace saw it, that shift. The moment when professionalism hardened into something else. Something colder. There was always a line, and they were inching closer to it. The other passengers were listening now. Grace felt their eyes, the occasional glances that darted quickly away whenever she looked up. The cabin wasn't silent, but there was an undercurrent of tension just beneath the surface that buzzed louder than the engines. "Sir," Mark said carefully, his voice dropping into a lower register. "I understand you're upset. I'll talk to Karen, and we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Sam's eyes narrowed. "And that's it?" Mark shifted, standing fully now, his arms folding loosely across his chest. "I'm asking you to trust that I'll handle this." Grace felt Sam's frustration radiate off him like heat. She reached for his hand beneath the tray table, squeezing lightly, a signal, "Don't let him pull you in." Karen was still watching. The plane dipped slightly, adjusting course. Outside the window, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the sky. But inside, everything was unraveling. "I'm sorry, but that's not good enough." Grace hadn't planned to say it. The words slipped out, soft but unwavering, hanging in the space between them like a challenge. Mark's eyes shifted to her now. "We've dealt with this before," she continued, her tone steady. "It happens in stores. It happens at work. And now it's happening here." Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't interrupt. Grace felt the weight of every word building, gathering in her chest like a flood she could no longer hold back. "I'm tired of waiting for someone to handle it. I want to know what happens next. I want to know what you say to her. And I want to know what happens after that." Mark glanced toward the rows behind them, as if suddenly aware of the growing audience. "We'll speak privately when we land," he offered, but Grace caught the subtle edge in his voice. It was a suggestion wrapped in a warning. Sam leaned forward, his voice firm but restrained. No, we're not waiting until we land. This needs to happen now. Mark hesitated just long enough for Karen to step forward. Her voice sliced through the cabin like ice. Is there a problem? Grace turned slowly, meeting Karen's gaze for the first time since it all began. Karen's smile was thin, her eyes hard. She stood just at the edge of the aisle, one hand resting lightly on the seat in front of her. It wasn't curiosity that brought her back, it was confidence. She thought she had already won. Grace stood, her body moving before her mind could catch up. The cabin felt impossibly small now. Karen's eyes met hers directly, as if daring her to step over that invisible line. You made this a problem, Grace said quietly. You didn't have to say anything. But you did. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. But no one spoke. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. I don't appreciate being accused. Grace didn't blink. I didn't accuse you of anything. I'm just telling you what happened. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Mark took a step between them, his hands raised slightly as if to create space. Let's not escalate this, he said. Grace's voice was calm, but unrelenting. It escalated the moment she said, you people. Karen stiffened. For a moment, everything felt suspended, balanced on the thin edge of what Grace knew could break at any second. She saw the shift in Karen's expression, the way her fingers curled slightly against the seat. But Grace didn't move. She had spent too long shrinking beneath gazes like this. Not today. Not this time. Mark exhaled heavily, his gaze flicking between them. Karen, I need you to return to the front of the cabin. Karen hesitated, but Mark's tone had shifted now. This isn't over, Karen muttered, turning sharply on her heel and disappearing down the aisle. Grace sank slowly into her seat, the adrenaline still buzzing through her veins. Sam leaned closer. You okay? Grace nodded, but her heart hadn't slowed. This wasn't over. It never was. The hush that followed Karen's departure was heavier than silence. Grace could feel it, pressing down on her skin like heat before a storm. It wasn't just from Karen, or Mark, or even the passengers pretending not to hear. It was the weight of something older, something stitched into the very fabric of the air they breathed. Sam exhaled beside her, his hands still clenched on the armrests. He hadn't said a word since Karen walked away, but Grace knew the war that was waging inside him. She could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his eyes stayed fixed on a single point beyond the seat in front of him. That's not going to be the end of it, Sam muttered under his breath, low enough that only Grace could hear. No, she agreed, it never is. Grace's gaze drifted across the cabin. Some passengers had returned to their magazines or phones, but others hadn't. A man 2 rows ahead glanced back at them, his face unreadable. A woman a few seats over shifted uneasily, tugging at her seatbelt as if it might ground her. The air was filled with the quiet discomfort of people who knew they had witnessed something but weren't sure what to do with it. And Grace hated that feeling most of all. Excuse me, came a voice from behind them. Grace turned to see a middle-aged black woman seated across the aisle. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. I saw what happened, the woman said, her eyes flickering toward the front of the cabin where Karen had vanished. You weren't wrong. Grace felt something loosen in her chest just slightly. Thank you, she said softly. The woman nodded but didn't linger. She settled back into her seat, eyes forward, her presence both comforting and distant. Sam's voice pulled Grace back. I don't get it, he said, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. We didn't do anything, Grace. We've been sitting here like everybody else. Grace met his gaze. There was exhaustion there, an old, familiar exhaustion that had followed them through years of small slights and quiet indignities. You know why, she replied gently. Sam looked at her for a long moment, then back toward the window. He didn't need her to explain. He had known the answer long before he asked the question. But knowing didn't make it easier. Across the aisle, Mark had returned to his seat near the front, his posture stiff, eyes forward. The calm facade he had worn earlier seemed thinner now, as if even he could feel the way the cabin was shifting beneath him. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly as she watched him. They're hoping we'll let it go, she said quietly. Sam didn't answer, but the way his jaw tightened told her he felt it too. Another 20 minutes passed before Julia reappeared. She approached carefully, her eyes flicking nervously toward the front of the cabin. Mr. and Mrs. Halloway, Julia began, her voice soft but careful. I just wanted to check in. Mark is handling the situation. Grace tilted her head slightly. Handling it how? Julia hesitated. Karen's been asked to stay in the crew area for the remainder of the flight. Sam let out a sharp breath. That's it? Julia's lips pressed together, and Grace could see the discomfort swimming behind her eyes. I understand how this feels, Julia said carefully. I just want to make sure you're comfortable for the rest of the flight. Sam leaned forward slightly. Comfortable? You think I'm uncomfortable because of where Karen is standing? His voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it now. That's not the problem. Julia's eyes darted nervously toward the passengers nearby. Sam, Grace said softly, reaching for his hand again. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, but he eased back into his seat. Julia swallowed hard. If you need anything at all, I'll be nearby. Grace nodded, offering a polite but distant smile. Thank you. As Julia walked away, Sam shook his head, his voice barely more than a whisper. You know what I hate? Grace glanced at him. That apology wasn't for us. Sam muttered, his eyes still locked on the aisle. It was for everybody else. For the people listening. Grace exhaled slowly. I know. Because that was how it always happened. Apologies meant to soothe the bystanders. To reassure the onlookers that everything was being handled. That they didn't need to feel uncomfortable for too long. But the apology didn't belong to them. It never had. Another 10 minutes passed, then 15. The plane drifted quietly through the sky. But Grace felt no closer to the ground. The problem wasn't that Karen had been asked to stay away. The problem was that she was still there. Still part of the crew. Still wearing that thin smile. Somewhere out of sight but not far enough away. And Grace knew this wasn't finished. The plane moved forward, but Grace felt like time was folding in on itself. Seconds stretched too long, yet each one carried the weight of something inevitable, something unseen but crawling closer. Sam shifted again. His leg bounced beneath the tray table, and Grace could feel the frustration rolling off him in quiet waves. She's still back there, he said, his voice low. Grace didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to look to know he was right. She could feel Karen's presence the way you feel something burning on the edge of your skin, out of sight but too close to ignore. She'll stay back there, Grace murmured, until we land. Sam's laugh was short and bitter. That's not the point, Grace. She'll stay because they're protecting her. Grace met his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't Karen's absence that lingered, but the knowledge that her presence would return the moment the plane touched down. She would step off that plane and go back to work, and they would carry the weight of this flight long after it ended. You think Mark's going to write up a report? Sam asked, tilting his head toward the front. He'll have his meeting with her behind some closed door. Maybe say a few words. And that'll be the end of it. Grace shifted slightly, folding her arms across her lap. Maybe. Sam stared at her. That's not good enough. I know, Grace said softly, but we're not leaving it at that. Sam's eyes narrowed. So what do we do? Grace's gaze drifted to the rows ahead, scanning the other passengers. The man across the aisle had put away his book, but Grace caught the way he glanced toward them from time to time. The woman behind them was still sitting rigid, pretending to nap, but her eyes fluttered open every few minutes. They were waiting. They were watching the way people watch car accidents, unable to look away but unsure if stepping in might pull them too close to the wreckage. Grace's voice was quiet, but firm. We let them know we're not going to disappear. Sam exhaled heavily through his nose, running a hand along the back of his neck. His frustration simmered, but Grace could feel the shift. The anger hadn't left him, but it had direction now. Another 20 minutes passed before Mark returned. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, he said, crouching near their seats once more. His voice was smoother this time, almost overly polite, the way people speak when they're trying to steer a conversation away from the edge. I wanted to check in and personally apologize again for the inconvenience. Grace tilted her head, meeting his gaze evenly. You've apologized, she said carefully. What I'm wondering is what happens after we land. Mark hesitated just long enough for Grace to catch it. I assure you, he began, this will be reported and investigated through the proper channels. The airline takes incidents like this seriously. Sam's eyes narrowed. What does that actually mean? Mark shifted, resting one arm on the seat back to steady himself. It means that Karen's behavior will be reviewed internally. And then? Sam pressed. Mark's eyes flickered, just briefly, to the other passengers. The tension in the cabin was palpable now. "With all due respect," Grace said softly, her tone calm but carrying the weight of something sharp. "We've heard those words before." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Grace continued, "You'll say it'll be handled. And maybe she'll get written up. Maybe she won't. But this doesn't stop with Karen." Mark's jaw tightened, and Grace saw it, the flicker of defensiveness rising behind his eyes. "This isn't just about her," Grace went on, her voice low but deliberate. "This is about the way you all protect each other. About how comfortable she felt saying those words in the first place." Sam nodded, leaning in. "And how comfortable you seem sweeping it under the rug." Mark's lips pressed together. He straightened slightly, adjusting his tie as if it might restore the authority he felt slipping away. "Sir," Mark said, his tone cooling, "I understand you're upset." "No," Sam interrupted, his voice tightening. "I'm angry." Grace could see it in Mark's face now, the cracks forming beneath the surface. The slow unraveling of his carefully maintained professionalism. He was losing control of the conversation. And he knew it. But Grace wasn't finished. "We need to know exactly what steps you're taking after this flight," she said, locking eyes with Mark. "And I expect to hear from someone beyond you." Mark hesitated, but the weight in Grace's voice left little room for argument. "I'll make sure someone follows up," Mark replied finally, his tone quieter now, though the stiffness in his posture remained. Grace nodded. "Good." Mark lingered for a moment longer, then straightened and walked away, disappearing toward the front of the cabin. Sam leaned back in his seat, arms crossed over his chest. "That's not going to change anything," he muttered. Grace rested her hand gently on his arm. "It might not," she admitted, "but we're not walking off this plane without being heard." Sam looked at her for a long moment before nodding. The plane began its descent soon after. But the tension in the cabin didn't ease. Grace felt it pressing against her chest, the knowledge that even after the wheels touched down, the fight wouldn't be over. Because the truth was, it never ended when the flight did. It followed you, long after the doors opened and the world carried on around you. But this time, Grace wasn't going to let it slip quietly into the shadows. This time, she would make sure the air stayed heavy. The seatbelt sign blinked on, casting small pools of amber light across the cabin. A voice crackled over the intercom, calm, rehearsed, indifferent. The captain spoke of weather conditions and the expected landing time, his words drifting over the passengers like a thin veil. But for Grace, the air beneath that voice felt sharp, like glass. Sam sat rigid beside her, arms folded tight against his chest. His eyes flickered toward the window. But Grace could tell he wasn't seeing the rolling expanse of clouds stretching below. His gaze was anchored somewhere deeper, somewhere that no window could reach. She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away, but his grip was tense, his knuckles cold beneath her touch. "She's going to be there," he said quietly, voice barely louder than the hum of the engine. Grace didn't need to ask who he meant. Karen. Of course, Karen would be there waiting near the exit, chin tilted just enough to make herself look unbothered, as if none of this had ever happened. The plane jolted slightly as it began its descent, and Grace tightened her seatbelt. The world outside the window darkened, clouds thickening until the sun became nothing more than a pale suggestion behind shifting gray. "Maybe she'll apologize," Grace said softly, though even as the words left her mouth, she didn't believe them. Sam turned to her, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You know better than that." Grace sighed, leaning her head back against the seat. "I know," she admitted, "but maybe I need to hear her say it." Sam didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened, but the weight beneath it hadn't lifted. "Apologies don't fix anything, Grace. You know that too." Grace nodded, but her gaze stayed forward, fixed on the aisle ahead. It wasn't the apology that mattered, it was the acknowledgement. The descent grew steeper, the plane dipping lower through layers of cloud and sky. Grace felt the subtle shift in pressure, the pop of her ears, the dull ache that followed. But the ache in her chest, the one that Karen's words had planted there, remained. She glanced around the cabin, watching the other passengers as they buckled seatbelts and gathered their things. They moved with the ease of people who were untouched by the weight that pressed down on Grace and Sam. No one met her gaze. The man who had peeked at them earlier now stared straight ahead, his hands neatly folded over the paperback in his lap. The woman behind them shifted nervously but said nothing. They were all too polite to look. Or perhaps they were too afraid of what might reflect back at them if they did. Sam's voice broke the silence. You know what the worst part is? Grace turned toward him. Sam didn't look at her when he spoke. His eyes stayed on the aisle ahead. His voice low and even. I almost didn't say anything. He admitted, when she first walked by. I almost let it go. I kept thinking maybe I imagined it. Maybe I misread the way she said it. Grace's stomach tightened. But you didn't, she said quietly. Sam's head dipped in a nod. No, he murmured. I didn't. Grace felt it then, the slow and bitter unraveling of something familiar. It was the weight of doubt. Not in themselves but in the way the world forced them to question what their eyes had already seen. The descent continued, the plane tilting gently to the left as the city lights below flickered into view like stars trapped beneath glass. Grace exhaled slowly, pressing her forehead against the cool window. There was no room for doubt now. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt. But the cabin remained tense. The hum of engines winding down as the plane taxied toward the gate. Passengers stirred, the familiar shuffle of bodies preparing to disembark filling the space around them. Overhead compartments clicked open, and the quiet murmurs of travelers echoed softly through the narrow aisle. But Grace and Sam stayed seated, unmoving. Let them go first, Sam muttered, nodding toward the line already forming in the aisle. Grace didn't argue. Instead, she watched the passengers filter past, each step taking them further from the weight that had settled over her and Sam like a second skin. When the crowd thinned, Sam finally stood, grabbing his carry-on from the overhead bin. Grace followed, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. And then she saw her. Karen stood near the exit. Just as Grace had expected, her posture straight, her face calm but unreadable. She wasn't smiling, not quite, but the faint curve of her lips suggested something else entirely. Grace felt Sam tense beside her, his grip tightening around the handle of his bag. But it wasn't Karen's expression that made Grace pause. It was the way she wouldn't meet their eyes. Karen's gaze slid past them, focusing somewhere over Grace's shoulder. As if they weren't even there, as if they were nothing more than shadows passing through the cabin. Grace's breath hitched. There would be no apology. Not here. Not now. Mark appeared near the exit, offering passengers polite nods and quiet farewells as they stepped off the plane. When his eyes met Grace's, there was a flicker of something like regret. But regret wasn't enough. As Grace and Sam stepped into the jet bridge, the cold air pressing against their skin, Grace finally spoke. We're not done with this, she said, her voice low but firm. Sam nodded, his gaze hardening. No, he agreed, we're not. And as they walked away, Grace knew this was only the beginning. The airport terminal stretched long and bright. But to Grace, the light felt thin, cold, sterile, the way hospitals felt beneath fluorescent bulbs. The distant hum of rolling suitcases and voices over the intercom passed over her ears like static. Sam walked beside her in silence. His face was unreadable, but Grace could see it in his eyes, the same tightness, the same weight that hadn't left him since they stepped off the plane. She could still feel Karen's presence behind them, as if the woman's shadow trailed after them, staining the polished floors beneath their feet. They didn't head toward baggage claim. Instead, they followed the signs pointing toward customer service. Do you really think they'll listen? Sam asked, his voice low. Grace didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed ahead, locked on the small cluster of desks where passengers stood in haphazard lines. Grievances ready at their lips. Maybe, she said finally, but I don't think that matters anymore. Sam glanced at her, but Grace didn't elaborate. She wasn't doing this for Karen. Not anymore. The line moved slowly, passengers shuffling forward with the kind of impatience that belonged to missed connections and lost luggage. But Grace stood still, her hands folded in front of her, gaze steady. Sam shifted beside her. They'll probably call it a misunderstanding. They will, Grace said softly. They'll say she didn't mean it like that. They will. And they'll apologize without apologizing. Grace turned toward him now, her eyes sharp and unwavering. I know, she said, holding his gaze, but we're still going to make them say it. Sam's mouth pressed into a thin line. But he didn't argue. When it was their turn, they stepped forward to the counter. A woman with a name tag that read Marla greeted them with the kind of polite indifference Grace had grown used to. Hi there, how can I help you today? Grace leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. We need to file a complaint about one of your employees. Marla's smile thinned. Her eyes flickered toward the computer screen, fingers poised over the keyboard. Of course, I can assist with that, Marla replied, but her tone had shifted slightly cooler, more cautious. Was this related to the flight you just arrived on? Yes, Sam said. His voice was sharper than Grace's. Less patient. It was. Marla's fingers danced over the keyboard, pulling up their flight information. Grace could see the flicker of questions in her eyes, the hesitation that came when people sensed a situation more complicated than missing luggage or seat assignments. What happened exactly? Marla asked, keeping her gaze firmly on the screen. Sam opened his mouth, but Grace touched his arm gently. She didn't want to rush this. Grace leaned forward, steady and deliberate. A flight attendant singled us out. She made a racist comment, and it wasn't the first time during the flight that she acted differently toward us. Marla's hands stilled over the keyboard. The words hung there, suspended between them like something fragile. But Grace refused to soften them. Marla's eyes finally lifted. I'm sorry to hear that. Grace nodded. I'm sure you are. Marla hesitated. Grace could see her weighing options. How quickly could she resolve this without letting it grow into something bigger? I'll escalate this to our supervisor, Marla said, her voice neutral. If you could provide some more details. I'll make sure this is handled through the right channels. Sam shifted, his frustration barely contained. Grace could feel it radiating off him like heat. Grace met Marla's gaze evenly. We'll wait. Marla blinked. Excuse me? Grace's voice didn't waver. We'll wait right here. We'd like to speak to someone today. Someone higher up. Marla hesitated again. But Grace didn't move. Neither did Sam. The tension stretched long enough that Marla's professional mask cracked just slightly. I'll see what I can do, she murmured, stepping away from the desk. As soon as she disappeared, Sam let out a slow breath. I don't know how you stay so calm, he said, shaking his head. Grace's lips tightened into a thin smile. I've had practice. Sam glanced down the terminal, eyes scanning the crowds. She's going to keep working flights. You know, he muttered, voice low with simmering frustration. That's what kills me. She's going to walk right back onto another plane and treat someone else the same way. Grace's gaze softened, but there was no warmth behind it. Maybe, she said quietly, but we won't let her pretend she never did this to us. The words felt heavier than she expected. Because the truth was they couldn't stop Karen from boarding that next flight. But they could force her to remember them. And sometimes, that was the first crack in the wall. Marla returned with a man in a dark blue suit. His ID badge clipped neatly to his belt. His face was blank in the way that supervisors are trained to be. But Grace caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He already knew why they were here. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, he said smoothly, offering his hand. I'm Mark Davidson, head of customer experience for this terminal. I understand there's been a concern regarding your flight. Grace took his hand, shaking it firmly. Yes, she replied, her voice even. There has. Mark gestured toward a small glass-walled office just beyond the counter. Why don't we step inside and talk? As they followed him, Grace felt something shift, not in the air, but in herself. This wasn't resolution, but it was a start. And sometimes, starting was the most dangerous thing you could do to a system that had grown too comfortable in the silence. The office was small, almost too small for 3 people. A single window stretched thin along the far wall, offering a sliver of the tarmac and planes resting beneath a bruised sky. The air inside was stale, weighed down by the kind of silence that followed uncomfortable truths. Mark gestured to 2 chairs opposite his desk. But Grace didn't sit, neither did Sam. She wasn't ready to make this comfortable. Mark adjusted his tie, sensing it. His professionalism was intact, but Grace could see the slight crease forming between his brow. The kind men wear when they know they've stepped into something larger than paperwork. I appreciate you both taking the time to speak with me, Mark began, his voice smooth but distant. I understand the situation on your flight was unfortunate. Sam's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing. Unfortunate? He repeated, the word rolling out slow, deliberate. Mark hesitated but kept his expression even. Yes, I've already spoken with the crew involved, he continued, folding his hands neatly over the desk. We take these kinds of complaints seriously. And I want to assure you that this will be addressed internally." Grace's lips tightened. "That's not enough," she said softly. Mark's eyes flicked toward her, surprise flashing just briefly before he caught himself. Grace stepped forward, resting her palms flat against the desk, leaning in just slightly. "I know how this works," she said, her voice low but steady. "You'll talk to Karen. She'll deny it, say we misheard her, or that it was taken out of context. Maybe she'll get a warning. Maybe she won't. Either way, she'll keep working." Mark opened his mouth, but Grace didn't let him speak. "And the next time she feels like reminding someone that they don't belong, she'll do it again, because she knows she can. Because this isn't the first time she's done it. And it won't be the last." The words hit the air like stones against glass. Mark shifted in his seat. The mask was slipping now. "I understand you're upset," he started carefully. Grace's eyes narrowed. "I'm not upset," she said, her voice rising slightly, enough to slice through the room's artificial calm. "I'm tired." Sam straightened beside her, his presence like an anchor. But he didn't interrupt. This was Grace's war now. And they both knew it. "I'm tired of people like you pretending this is a misunderstanding." Grace pressed on, her voice hardening. "I'm tired of being made to feel like we're the ones making this difficult because we decided not to stay silent." Mark's gaze faltered, drifting to the corner of his desk as if the answers might be written somewhere beneath the grain of the wood. Grace leaned in closer. "We didn't imagine it," she said quietly, but the force beneath her words was unmistakable. She said what she said. "And you know it." The weight of the room shifted. Mark exhaled slowly, his shoulders dipping just slightly, like a man realizing the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. "I believe you," he said finally. The words caught Grace off guard for half a second, but she didn't let it show. "But believing this doesn't change anything, does it?" Sam cut in, stepping forward. His voice wasn't loud, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet sharpness that felt dangerous in the stillness. Mark hesitated. "No," he admitted, his voice soft but honest. "Not if this stays here." The room felt thinner now, as if the walls themselves were pressing in, listening. Mark's gaze lifted, and something flickered behind his eyes, reluctance. Perhaps, but something else too. A man who had lived too long with the weight of decisions he hadn't made. "I can escalate this," Mark said carefully. "Push for a more formal review. But I'll be honest with you, it won't happen quickly." Sam exhaled, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "Why does it have to be hard every time?" he asked, shaking his head. "Why do we have to fight this hard just to get someone to do what they should have done the first time?" Mark's eyes dropped. Grace didn't move. She let the silence sit between them like something sacred, something that couldn't be brushed aside with apologies or paperwork. Finally, Mark looked up. "I'll personally handle this," he said quietly. "I'll make sure it goes as far as it can." Grace held his gaze for a long moment, searching his face for cracks, for the signs of a man who might fold the second they walked out that door. But she didn't find them. Sam shifted beside her. "We'll hold you to that," he said, his voice firm. Mark nodded. "I expect you will." The weight of the conversation lingered as they left the office, the hum of the terminal swelling around them like the tide. Sam slowed as they walked, his gaze drifting toward the window where planes idled quietly on the runway. "You believe him?" he asked. Grace's eyes stayed forward. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I know he believes us." And for now, that was the thread Grace held onto, the small crack in the system that, if pulled hard enough, might just widen into something larger. Maybe nothing would change. Maybe Karen would board another plane, smile that tight, hollow smile, and remind someone else that the air they were breathing didn't quite belong to them. But maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't. And maybe that was enough to keep pulling at the thread. The airport glass doors slid open, spilling Grace and Sam into the heavy, humid air of the late afternoon. The sky was thick with the weight of summer, but the heat did nothing to soften the coiled tension that sat between them like an uninvited guest. They walked in silence toward the curb, where cars pulled in and out, passengers reuniting with family or disappearing into waiting cabs. But Grace's mind wasn't on the street in front of her. It was still back there in that cramped office, in the flicker behind Mark's eyes when he said he believed them. Believing was easy. Acting on it was something else entirely. Sam placed their bags in the trunk of a taxi, his movements sharp and wordless. When he finally slid into the seat beside her, his gaze stayed forward, fixed on something Grace couldn't see. He's not going to fix this, Sam said flatly, breaking the silence as the car pulled away from the curb. Grace didn't respond right away. She watched the airport fade into the distance, the runways stretching like veins beneath the orange-pink glow of the setting sun. I know, she said softly. Sam turned toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then why do we keep doing this, Grace? Why do we keep playing along filing complaints? Talking to people like Mark when nothing ever changes? His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. Grace felt the weight of it, heavy as the sky pressing down on the tops of their heads. I don't know, she admitted, but if we don't speak, they get to believe it never happened. And I won't let her walk away that easy. Sam exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Karen's going to keep flying. And next time, it's going to be someone else. That's how this works. Grace stared at him, her eyes steady. I'm not doing this for Karen, she said. Sam's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew as well as she did this wasn't about one woman in a uniform. It wasn't even about Mark or the apology he had offered with such careful detachment. It was about the weight that had followed them long before that flight. The weight that sat at their table in restaurants when service came slower for them than for the couple seated 2 booths over. The weight that lingered in dressing rooms, in department stores, in the cautious, rehearsed smiles of people who didn't know how to meet their eyes but always knew how to watch them. Karen wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. But Grace wasn't going to leave that plane without making sure someone really felt it. Even if that someone was just Mark, sitting alone in his office after they were gone. The taxi rolled to a stop outside their hotel. Sam paid the fare while Grace stepped out, gazing up at the building's mirrored windows reflecting the dying light. Do you think Mark will call? Sam asked, standing beside her. Grace smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. No, she said, I think we'll have to remind him. 3 days passed before Grace sent the email. She wrote it in the early hours of the morning, when the city outside their hotel window was still half asleep, the streets humming softly beneath the glow of traffic lights. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time before she started typing. The words forming not out of anger but from something colder, something sharper. She didn't ask for an apology. She asked for details. She asked to know the process who reviewed the complaints. What policies were in place? What disciplinary actions were considered for employees like Karen? She made sure to include a single line at the end. One that sat on the screen like a stone. I trust the airline understands the gravity of this situation. If not, I am more than willing to escalate it beyond this office. She didn't sign it with hostility. She signed it with her name. Because the simple fact of being who she was in a country that often made her feel she had to apologize for it was confrontation enough. Sam watched from the other side of the room as she pressed send. You really think they'll listen to that? He asked. Grace shut the laptop gently, turning toward him with the calm of someone who had fought this battle too many times to count. They'll listen, she said, because now they know I won't stop speaking. The response came sooner than Grace expected. It wasn't from Mark. It came from someone higher, a name Grace didn't recognize, but whose title carried the weight of corporate authority. The language was polished, but Grace could read between the lines. Karen was under investigation. A formal inquiry had been opened. Mark's notes from their meeting had been filed. But none of that mattered as much as the final line, buried near the bottom of the email. The crew member involved has been temporarily suspended from all scheduled flights until the review is complete. Sam read over Grace's shoulder, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the message. She's not fired, he said. Grace nodded. No. Sam leaned back in his chair. So what now? Grace let the words settle, the corners of her mouth curving into something subtle but firm. Now, she said softly, we make sure they know we're still watching. Because that's how it had always been. The world didn't change with one meeting or one complaint. It changed because people like Grace refused to let the weight of silence win. And if Karen thought she could disappear quietly back into her uniform, she was wrong. Grace wasn't going anywhere. Grace sat by the hotel window, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the city stretched out beneath her. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the streets below. But Grace wasn't watching the skyline. Her phone sat on the table beside her, silent. It had been 4 days since the email arrived, 4 days since the airline informed her that Karen had been temporarily suspended. And 4 days of silence since. Sam leaned against the far wall, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze distant. He wasn't pacing, but Grace could feel the restless energy radiating off him. She's going to keep her job, Sam said finally, breaking the stillness. Grace didn't respond immediately. She might, she admitted. Sam shook his head, letting out a slow, frustrated breath. And then what? She'll walk back onto another flight like nothing happened. Maybe she won't say, "You people," out loud next time. Maybe she'll just find another way. Grace's eyes drifted toward him, soft but steady. And maybe she won't. Sam glanced at her, brow furrowing. You really believe that? Grace smiled faintly, small, tired. I believe she's thinking about it right now. It wasn't revenge Grace wanted. It was the weight of consequence. The quiet that followed people like Karen after they had been exposed the way it sat with them. Heavy and inescapable. Because the truth was, racism didn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it wore silence. Sometimes, it walked with people long after they had closed their mouths. Karen might not lose her job, but Grace would make sure she lost the comfort that came with knowing no one would call her by name. Later that evening, Grace and Sam sat quietly over dinner. The restaurant was half full, the soft hum of conversation drifting around them like a distant river. Sam sipped his water, but Grace barely touched her plate. They're going to forget, Sam said, his fork idly pushing food around. People always forget. Grace set her glass down, her eyes narrowing slightly. Not this time. Sam glanced up. She leaned in, lowering her voice. We make them remember. Not just Karen. All of them. Sam's brow arched. And how exactly do we do that? Grace met his gaze, the fire flickering just behind her eyes. We tell the story. Sam blinked, setting his fork down. You want to go public? Grace nodded. Why not? Because, Sam said carefully, we've been down that road before. People listen for a week, maybe two, then something else happens, and it fades. You know that. Grace exhaled, tilting her head slightly. It fades because we let it. But what if we didn't? Sam leaned back, watching her carefully now. You're serious. Grace's voice lowered, but the conviction in it deepened. I'm tired of letting people like Karen slip away quietly. We write it down. We send it out. Not in anger but the truth. The way it happened. People need to know what it feels like to sit on that plane and wonder if anyone else will speak up for you. Sam's eyes softened, and for a moment, he didn't speak, but Grace could feel the shift happening, the slow unraveling of doubt. The way resolve takes shape when it has nowhere else to go. Finally, Sam nodded. All right, let's tell them. Grace stayed up late that night, writing. She sat at the small desk in their hotel room, the faint hum of Sam's breathing behind her as he slept. But Grace couldn't sleep. The words poured out of her, deliberate and slow. She wrote about the small things, the stiffness in Karen's smile, the sharp edge in her voice when she leaned too close, the way passengers glanced away as if hoping to unsee what had been done right in front of them. She wrote about the silence that followed, the quiet war waged not in grand moments, but in the space between words, in the way people measured their anger, folding it neatly to keep from unraveling in front of strangers. By the time dawn touched the horizon, Grace's piece was finished. She reread it twice before pressing send. The email went to 3 local papers, a civil rights organization she had followed for years, and the airline's corporate office. She didn't expect them all to respond, but someone would, and that was enough. The first reply came 2 days later. A journalist wanted to interview Grace and Sam, not just about Karen but about the larger issue, how often these small moments unfolded for Black travelers in spaces that claimed to serve everyone. Sam hesitated at first. They're just going to sensationalize it, he warned, rubbing the back of his neck as Grace read the email aloud. Grace set the phone down, meeting his eyes across the room. Maybe, but that's not the point. Then what is? She smiled faintly. The point is, Karen's going to read about herself in the morning paper, and Mark's going to answer calls he didn't expect. Sam exhaled, but this time, there was no fight left in him. All right, he said, let's give them something to write about. By the end of the week, the story had spread further than Grace imagined. More travelers began sharing their experiences online, moments they had swallowed, convinced no one would listen. Karen's name never made the headlines, but Grace didn't need it to. It wasn't about Karen anymore. It was about the passengers who sat quietly on flights every day, wondering if the world would believe them when they finally stood up. And this time, Grace had made sure they weren't alone. It was strange, Grace thought, how quickly silence could shift. One moment, it was the heavy cloak worn by those who had no power by people like her and Sam, who had learned, over the years, to shrink themselves beneath the weight of watchful eyes. And then, suddenly, silence became something else entirely. It became the quiet that followed them. Karen, Mark, the airline, the silence that clung to people when they were afraid of what the world might say if they spoke too soon, or too loudly, or at all. Grace sat by the window of their small hotel room, staring at the morning paper that had been left at their door. She hadn't expected front-page coverage, but there it was, a headline that didn't name Karen, but named the thing she carried. Racial discrimination at 30,000 feet. A passenger's story shines light on airline bias. Sam moved quietly behind her. Still waking. She's seen it by now, Sam said, his voice rough from sleep. Grace nodded. I know. Karen had been suspended. Yes, but suspensions had a way of fading, shrinking until they became little more than paper in someone's drawer. But this would not be so easily forgotten. Karen would step back into the airport. Someday soon, she would slip into her uniform, straighten her hair, and prepare to greet passengers with that same careful smile. But she would carry this with her. The eyes of strangers at the gate. The weight of whispers passing between the rows of seats. The knowing looks. It wasn't punishment. Not really. But Grace knew the quiet could be loud when it wanted to be. Later that afternoon, Sam left for a walk. Grace stayed behind, unable to shake the feeling that more was coming. She sat by the window, watching the sun dip lower across the skyline. And then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed. It was Mark. For a long moment, Grace simply stared at the screen. She considered letting it ring out, letting him feel, if only for a little while, the discomfort of unanswered questions. But she pressed accept instead. Mrs. Holloway, Mark said after a beat. His voice was calm, but Grace could hear the hesitation lingering beneath it. I wanted to follow up regarding the situation with our crew member. Grace leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. I'm listening. Mark cleared his throat. After careful review, we've decided to extend the suspension. Karen will not be returning to her duties until further notice. Grace said nothing. Mark hesitated. We're also implementing new training programs, focusing on bias and sensitivity for all our staff. I just wanted to personally assure you. Grace cut him off, her voice smooth but firm. You didn't call to assure me, Mark. You called because someone made you. The line fell quiet. She didn't need to see him to know he had shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie the way he always did when the conversation drifted too close to something uncomfortable. Mrs. Holloway, he began, but Grace wasn't interested in the script. This isn't about training, she said softly. You can't train someone not to hate the space I take up. You can't train them to stop believing that this world belongs more to them than to me. Mark sighed, and for the first time, Grace caught something different in his voice. It's not enough, Mark admitted, quietly. I know. Grace closed her eyes briefly. No, it wasn't enough, but at least he had said it. Then make sure it doesn't stop here, she replied. Another long pause. Finally, Mark spoke again, his voice lower, as if confessing something he hadn't meant to say out loud. You're not the first, Mrs. Holloway. Grace's heart tightened. She knew that already, but hearing it spoken aloud, the quiet admission that this wasn't just about her, but about every black passenger who had sat quietly on a flight. Swallowing their anger struck something deeper. I know I'm not, Grace said softly. Mark didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. That evening, Sam returned, and Grace told him everything. Sam sat by the edge of the bed, hands clasped loosely between his knees, listening. So she's gone for now, Sam said when Grace finished. Grace nodded. For now. Sam's gaze drifted toward the window. Thoughtful. I wonder how many others there are, he murmured. Grace followed his gaze, watching as lights flickered to life across the darkening city. Too many, she answered. A long silence stretched between them, but this one didn't feel heavy. It felt like something else, something unfinished, but hopeful. Do you regret pushing this far? Sam asked, turning to look at her. Grace's eyes softened. No, she said, I don't. Because the truth was, this wasn't just about one flight. It was about every moment that had come before it and every moment that would follow. It was about refusing to shrink beneath the weight of someone else's gaze. And Grace knew whether Karen returned or not, whether Mark followed through or let this fade, the world was a little less quiet now. And sometimes, that was enough to keep going. Grace had always known that some battles didn't end with victory or defeat, they simply shifted, settling into the corners of life like shadows that stretched as far as the eye could see. She sat quietly on the hotel balcony, the city breathing beneath her, its lights twinkling like small, distant truths. Sam stood by the railing, his silhouette outlined against the haze of traffic below. He hadn't spoken in a while, and Grace understood why. There were no easy words for the kind of exhaustion that came with being right and knowing it wouldn't be enough. Karen's suspension wasn't a victory. Mark's apology wasn't redemption. And yet, there was something different now. Grace could feel it in the air, soft, fragile, but present. It wasn't justice, but it was an acknowledgement. And sometimes, that was where the real work began. Sam turned, leaning back against the railing. You think they'll really change anything? Grace didn't look at him. She kept her gaze on the skyline. I don't know. Sam shifted, crossing his arms. Feels like they're just waiting for this to pass. For us to forget. Grace nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of the glass in her hand. They are, she said, but forgetting isn't something we get to do. Sam's eyes narrowed slightly. And what about everyone else? Grace finally turned to him, her eyes soft but steady. They don't have to remember for this to matter. We do. Sam exhaled, running a hand over his face. Feels heavy, he muttered. It is, Grace replied simply. Because that was the truth of it, the weight was heavy. And there was no setting it down. But Grace had learned long ago that the weight wasn't meant to be carried alone. The following morning, Grace's phone buzzed with a message. It wasn't from Mark. It wasn't from the airline. It was from a woman Grace had never met, her name written plainly in the subject line. No titles, no formality. The message was short, but it cut through Grace like lightning. I was on the flight. I saw what happened. I didn't say anything then. And I've regretted it every day since. Thank you for speaking up. I won't be silent next time. Grace sat still for a long time, reading the message over and over. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she passed the phone to Sam. He read the message twice before setting it down, his face unreadable. So someone else was paying attention. He murmured. Grace smiled faintly. They always are. Sam didn't speak, but she could see the shift in his eyes, the quiet understanding that this fight, the one they had carried for so long, wasn't being fought alone anymore. It wasn't the kind of change that made headlines or rewrote policies overnight. But it was something. It was a crack in the silence. 2 weeks later, Grace and Sam boarded another flight. This time, there was no Karen waiting at the gate. No lingering stares. But Grace felt the tension in her shoulders anyway. The way old wounds sometimes ache even after they've healed. As the plane ascended, she glanced around the cabin. The flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, smiling politely, handing out drinks. One of them, a young woman with dark hair tied neatly at the back of her neck, paused beside Grace's row. Is there anything I can get for you? She asked, her voice light. Grace smiled, shaking her head. No, thank you. But just as the attendant turned to leave, she hesitated, lowering her voice slightly. I read the article, she said softly. I'm glad you said something. Grace blinked, caught off guard. Before she could respond, the woman was already moving down the aisle. Grace leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. Sam glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. What was that about? Grace shrugged, but the faint smile tugging at her lips betrayed her. Nothing, she said quietly. Just someone paying attention. And as the plane climbed higher, Grace let her eyes drift to the window, watching the clouds break open beneath them. There was no resolution waiting at the end of this journey. But as long as someone was watching, as long as someone else remembered, Grace knew the fight wasn't over. And maybe, just maybe, that was how the world began to change.